The third crucial aspect of positive energy districts is that of energy flexibility, which means if and how districts are flexible in the times when they consume and need energy so that they can adapt to possibly advantageous and possibly disadvantageous situations in the surrounding energy grid. Imagine in the wintertime where electricity is typically coming from sources with a higher emission intensity, such as coal power plants, gas-fired power plants, which are more dirty. And in the summertime, when there is more sun available and more hydropower and more photovoltaics, electricity from the grid tends to be more renewable. And also in between seasonal changes, there are times where there is more wind blowing, leading to higher wind power production, and times where there's less wind. So these renewable sources are typically more volatile, meaning they are more time dependent on when and how they are available. Now, in principle, this is a issue for a number of reasons, such as grid stability, because inside an electricity grid, energy demand and energy supply always at every microsecond needs to be in balance. Otherwise, the grid frequency starts to fall off and grid worst case can collapse and lead to blackouts. So this is one issue. And the other issue is that if the energy generation from renewable sources is very time dependent and not matching the energy demand times, then the energy needs to be stored somewhere. And these storage options, such as electric batteries, are typically relatively expensive. So we try to reduce the amount of storage that we need. And one main strategy of doing this is by increasing our flexibility in when we need the energy. So in this tool, energy flexibility can be achieved in two major ways. One is by overheating and cooling the buildings to a higher degree than it would be otherwise necessary. This, for example, means in wintertime, not just heating the indoor temperature up to 20 degrees or 22 degrees, but rather heating it up to 23, 24, 25, even 26 degrees, because and only if there is an excess of renewable energy in the grid currently. Because even in winter times, there are times where it is sunny, where there's a lot of wind, where there is an excess of renewables, and we can store these excess renewables by overheating our buildings. And in the same time, in summertime, it's even better because then there's typically even more renewable energy available, and we can pre-cool the buildings during the day where there's a lot of renewables available, and so that we need less renewables during night and times of lower renewable availability. The way you can use these strategies in the tool is here by, first of all, principally enabling the flexible grid use option. Here it's already enabled, yes or no. And then there's these two major strategies. One is to overheat or overcool the buildings in times of excess renewable availability. You can say yes to that. And the other thing is using the hot water tanks to increase their temperature as well if there is an excess of renewable available. Now, keep in mind, these systems only work if you have a district that uses electricity for heating and cooling, meaning if you have a heat pump based solution. If you have solutions that require district heating or even natural gas, then you cannot use grid flexibility in the same way because you don't need as much or barely any electricity for heating and cooling. This is also why, if you include these options, you will see here these cyan colored bars that represent the flexible grid use, meaning the amount of electricity drawn from the grid only in times where there is an excess of renewable energy. And you will see when you look at the energy end use, where you have three variations and scenarios compared directly. One is natural gas, one is district heating, and what is the heat pump solution. You will see that it will only affect the heat pump solution. And here, for example, you can see how much of an effect it has, because almost a third, or let's say a quarter of the entire energy demand for the heat pumps of the heating and cooling system of the district can become from renewable sources from the grid, which drastically improves the primary energy balance. And you can see how much effect that has. So here we have 25.8 kilowatt hours per square meters of regular grid electricity, which can be rather dirty, and only on 14 kilowatt hours coming from flexible use of the grid. Now, if I turn this off and rerun the calculation, you will see that the entirety of the heat pump solution will only be covered by grid electricity and, to a lesser extent, the photovoltaics. I will need to rerun the calculation though. And another thing you will see in a moment when the simulation updates is that the entire energy demand will drop a little bit, as you can see here. It is dropping because the downside of the flexible grid use is that when you're preheating or pre-cooling the buildings, it is getting a higher temperature relative to the outside air. Imagine in the winter, outside temperature might be 0 degrees. When you have an indoor temperature of 25 degrees, you will have higher thermal energy heat losses because you have a higher discrepancy between indoor and outdoor temperature. If the indoor temperature is 20 degrees, you will have a little bit lower losses as when the temperature is indoors is 25 degrees. So it might be a more comfortable situation for some of the users, but it comes at a small price of efficiency. And you can see here that the overall energy demand, if you don't do these flexibility options, decreases a little bit. But typically, if you're looking at the final energy balance of the primary energy balance here, for example, here you can see now the heat pump situation is with, we have the option unselected. So the regular heat pump solution scenario is the same as the heat pump with flexible operation, because the last scenario with flexible operation just means it considers also demand side management, flexible operations, whether you use it or not. So this means if we turn this off, then it is not considered, and basically the scenario becomes the same as the heat pump without flexibility by default. But now if we say yes and we rerun it, you can see the difference that it makes in the final energy assessment. Because yes, we use a little bit, slightly more energy, but the energy is far more renewable, and that leads to a much better overall balancing assessment and overall primary energy balance. At the moment now it's the same. And once it updates here, sometimes it's necessary to save the workbook to update properly. And now you see the difference. It almost drops by half because the primary energy that is required to produce the electricity in the first place, it's so much lower when we use the grid flexibly. So this is one of the major impacts that we can have, but it means we need to have an electric energy system or energy systems with heat pumps and a distribution system of the heat by floor heating or concrete core activation that can actually make use of the thermal storage of the district. This needs to be ensured. The model doesn't, the tool doesn't model this explicitly, but if you have these options in your district, you should definitely take them.